welcome, and thank you for finding your way here. If you'd like to join me on this quiet journey, I'd love to have you subscribe. And please share with me any topics you'd most like me to explore. This is a quiet space, one made for soft voices and overlooked stories. Whether you sleep through every word or stay with me until the end, let's start to get relaxed. Turn on your fan, put on your eye mask, settle into your favorite weighted blanket, and close your eyes. Let's begin by taking 2 long deep breaths and then sigh them out. We will start to switch your brain into a more relaxed state. Clear your mind and just listen to my words. As a woman, I choose to give honor and respect to other women. In researching this topic, I was inspired by the strength, wisdom, and brilliance I discovered. Let's hope you are too. I hope you enjoy this telling. We do not honor these women because of the color of their skin, but rather in spite of how history has so often overlooked them because of it. Their stories span kingdoms, centuries, and continents, not as a monolith, but as a mosaic of strength. And while they may not have been defined by race in their own time as we might define it now, we gather their names here not to limit them, but to shine light where the shadows of historians sometimes falls. Across the wide sweep of history, too many thrones occupied by women have been pushed to the margins, their power whispered about rather than proclaimed. But the deserts, jungles, and coasts of Africa have long known the footsteps of queens, not ornaments to power, but power itself. Rulers, warriors, strategists, diplomats, and visionaries. Their names may not echo as loudly in the Western canon, but their legacies are carved into the land, the stories, and the hearts of their people. Some of the most remarkable rulers to shape the world did so while cloaked not in imperial robes or crowned in gold, but veiled in silence, ignored, erased, or minimized in the annals of conventional history. They were queens, commanders, defenders, and visionaries, many of them women of African descent who held power not in spite of their identity, but because of it. Their leadership was often born of necessity, sharpened by resistance, and carried forward by sheer intellect, instinct, and an unshakable sense of duty to their people. This is not a tale of token victories or symbolic figureheads. These are stories of women who led armies, negotiated peace, outmaneuvered colonizers, built cities, passed laws, forged alliances, and held spiritual or cultural sway that shaped entire civilizations. They ruled in lands from the lush highlands of Ethiopia to the fortified plains of West Africa, from the palaces of Nubia to the fortified compounds of the Ashanti Empire. Some reigned for decades, others left legacies in a single brilliant act, but all refused to be footnotes. This script is an invitation to remember them not in the dry tones of textbooks, but in the warm cadence of storytelling. To speak their names aloud, to let their choices breathe through time, to recognize their cunning, compassion, and command. Some are well known in history, but too often reduced to romance and rarely acknowledged as the linguistically gifted ruler and strategist they were. Others, like Queen Amani Shaketo or Tasi Hangbe Mai, be unfamiliar, yet no less worthy of reverence. And if you've never heard of Queen Nzinga of Angola, who faced down the Portuguese with wit sharper than Steeler Amanirenas, the Candake of Kush, who left a Roman governor's statue head buried under temple steps as a message, then this is your gentle nudge to settle in. Because these stories matter, not as novelty, but as necessary truth. This isn't about rewriting history, it's about revealing what was always there waiting. Tucked beneath layers of colonial narrative, behind the smudged ink of male scribes who couldn't imagine a woman leading an empire, let alone defending one with unshakable resolve. These women weren't exceptions. They were part of a long, proud lineage of leadership, brilliance, and resilience. So, come closer. Let your breath slow. Let the night wrap around you like a warm cloak. This is not the story of kings and their conquests. This is the story of Black women who ruled, and you are very much invited to listen. Let us begin where myth and memory entwine in the luminous tale of a queen whose wisdom crossed deserts and centuries. Makeda, known more widely as the Queen of Sheba, sits at the crossroads of legend, scripture, and royal lineage, a woman cloaked not just in mystery, but in meaning. Her name flickers through time like a torch passed from storyteller to scholar, each retelling layering her legacy with admiration, awe, or agenda. And yet, even across 3 continents and countless centuries, she remains more than a shadow. She is a symbol of wealth, of diplomacy, of feminine intelligence that dazzled even kings. Though her historicity is debated, her legend is indelible. The Hebrew Bible speaks of a queen who journeyed from the ends of the earth to test King Solomon with riddles, a woman unafraid to question the wisest man alive. She is described as arriving with a caravan heavy with gold, spices, and precious stones, an offering not of submission, but of sovereign equality. She came not as a subject, but as a peer. This encounter, sparse in detail, yet rich in implication, has inspired 1,000 reimaginings. In Ethiopian tradition, she is Makeda, a monarch whose union with Solomon birthed a dynastic Solomonic line that would rule Ethiopia for centuries and claim descent from the House of David. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast expands on her story with reverence, depicting her as a wise and pious ruler whose journey to Jerusalem was both political and spiritual. Her legacy lives not only in scripture, but in the very fabric of Ethiopian identity, woven into songs, ceremonies, and statecraft. Arabian lore too claims her, naming her Bilqis. In the Quran, she is a queen who submits to God after witnessing the power and wisdom of Solomon. Yet even here, she is no passive figure. Her intelligence, her governance, her grace under pressure, these are central to the narrative. Whether in scripture or story, she is not just a guest in a king's court, but a ruler in her own right. What does it mean that so many cultures sought to claim her, that her myth survived not just through admiration, but through appropriation? It suggests a woman so formidable that history bent to include her, even if reluctantly. It suggests that she filled a silence ancient scribes dared not leave empty. She remains a mirror reflecting the aspirations of those who invoke her name. For Ethiopia, she is mother of a royal line. For feminists, she is proof that intelligence and leadership are not bound by gender. For theologians, she is an interfaith bridge. For poets and dreamers, she is the queen who traveled across a continent to speak her mind. And so Makeda stands, not fixed in time, but timeless. A figure draped in gold and enigma, with riddles on her lips and legacy at her feet. And of course there was Queen Amanirenas of Kush, was not merely a ruler. She was a resistance etched in obsidian, a one-eyed warrior who stared down the Roman Empire and did not blink. In the Unnist century BCE, when Rome's reach extended hungrily beyond Egypt and into Nubia, Amanirenas was not content to bow or bargain. She ruled the kingdom of Kush, a land steeped in its own grandeur, pyramids rising from desert soil, cities humming with trade, and a lineage of Kandaks, or queen mothers, who wielded both political and military power. Amanirenas, one of the most formidable among them, was ready when the empire came knocking. The Romans, led by the newly installed prefect of Egypt, invaded Kushite territory. In response, Amanirenas mounted a counter-offensive so bold it bordered on myth. She and her troops stormed into southern Egypt, capturing the city of Syene, modern Aswan, leveling statues of Augustus, and dragging the bronze head of one such statue back to Kush as a trophy where it was buried beneath the steps of a temple, so that all who entered would tread upon Rome's pride. That head still exists today, glaring in defiance from the halls of the British Museum, its expression caught forever in that moment of imperial humiliation. Amanirenas wasn't merely retaliating, she was defending sovereignty, culture, and spiritual legacy. Her people didn't share Rome's hunger for conquest. Theirs was a civilization rooted in the Nile's rhythms, in trade, in ritual, in the thunderous silence of the desert. The Romans underestimated that quiet power and paid the price. For 3 years, war simmered across Egypt's southern frontier. Roman forces retaliated, destroying Napata, a Kushite city of significance, but Amanirenas remained unbroken. Her military campaigns and diplomatic cunning ultimately forced Rome to reconsider its imperial ambition. The war ended not in conquest, but in negotiation, an outcome nearly unheard of when Rome faced a smaller power. A peace treaty was signed around 20 BCE that favored Kush. Rome retreated. No taxes, no tribute, no Roman garrisons. Let that sink in. Amanirenas didn't just resist, Ramesh forced them to back down. In accounts left by Roman historians, always a little reluctant to fully credit those they considered outsiders, Amanirenas is painted as fierce, determined, and one-eyed. Whether that injury was literal or symbolic, it became emblematic of her focused vision, a queen who saw through the illusion of Rome's invincibility and dared to push back. Kushite society, remarkably egalitarian in its reverence for female leadership, supported her. The role of Kandake wasn't ceremonial. These women commanded armies, ruled lands, and shaped policy. Amanirenas stood not as an anomaly, but as part of a powerful lineage. Yet it is her name that echoes loudest when we speak of the Kushite resistance. Her legacy endures not in polished marble or Latin texts, but in grit and desert winden, the memory of a queen who made the greatest empire on earth take a step back. And isn't that a story to whisper as you drift to sleep? A tale of sand, strength, and sovereignty carried on the hush of Nubian night air. Close your eyes and you might still hear the jingle of her warrior's armor, the low call of a Nubian horn, the whisper of defiance braided into desert stars. Amanirenas doesn't demand remembrance, she commands it. And then there was she, Queen Nzinga Mbande of Ndongo and Matamba. She was born into resistance, born into royalty, born into war. And from her first breath, she seemed carved not of softness, but of resolve. In the early 1600s, when European powers clawed their way into Central Africa with greed disguised as trade, Nzinga didn't just observe as she countered. Her rule was not a reaction to power, it was a reclamation of it. Born around 1583, Nzinga was a princess of the Mbundu people in what is now Angola. Her father, Ngola Kiluanji Kiasamba, was a ruler who grappled with Portuguese encroachment. Her name, Nzinga, is said to have come from the umbilical cord being wrapped around her neck at birth, a sign, in Mbundu tradition, that she would be a powerful and proud woman. How right they were. When her brother ruled Ndongo, Nzinga was sent as an emissary to negotiate with the Portuguese. The image is striking. A woman diplomat, regal in bearing, refusing to sit on the floor before her colonial counterparts. Instead, she motioned for one of her aides to kneel behind her and used him as a human chair. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. A visual declaration that she would not bow, not shrink, not be less than any man or foreigner across the table. But diplomacy was not enough. When her brother died, possibly by poison, Nzinga stepped into power, and where other leaders might have hesitated, she charged. She formed alliances with rival states and even with the Dutch, an extraordinary move for an African queen in a chess game dominated by European kings. She orchestrated rebellions, launched guerrilla attacks, and pulled the Portuguese into a war of attrition that they neither expected nor could easily win. Nzinga's military strategies were precise. She led from the front, clad in warrior garb, armed with more than just weapons. She had intellect and psychological prowess. She adopted male dress, took concubines, and even participated in battle rituals that unsettled both her enemies and her allies. Her rule defied European notions of womanhood, leadership, and decorum. And that was entirely the point. But she wasn't only a warrior, she was also a builder. Nzinga restructured her kingdom, integrating captured peoples and instilling systems of governance that prioritized cohesion and survival. She protected escaped, enslaved Africans, offered sanctuary, and created a buffer against the slave trade that devoured so many of her neighbors. She didn't just fight colonialism, she created an alternative to it. Even in her later years, as time weathered her armor, Nzinga remained sharp. She converted to Christianity strategically. She adopted Portuguese customs selectively. She played the long game. And though she signed peace treaties, it was not submission but savvy. By the time of her death in 1663, she had ruled for nearly 40 years. Queen Nzinga became more than a monarch. She became a myth, a symbol of defiance, a name whispered through generations as proof that Black women have not merely endured history, they've shaped it. Her story reminds us that power doesn't always come with a crown. Sometimes it rides on horseback, carries a spear, and negotiates terms on its own terms. Her legacy survives not in golden statues or marble halls, but in the indelible idea that to lead is to imagine freedom in the face of chains and then to chase it down with a warrior's heart. Amana Shaketo's name might not grace the covers of many world history textbooks, but once upon the banks of the Nile, beyond the reach of Roman conquest, and nestled in the gold-laden land of Kush, ruled with authority forged from both elegance and iron. She reigned in the 1st century BCE, during a golden age of the Meroitic kingdom. This was a time when the Kandakesqueen mothers or ruling queens were more than ceremonial figures. They were commanders, decision-makers, and stewards of spiritual and earthly affairs. Among them, Amana Shaketo stands out not just for her power, but for what she left behind, one of the richest caches of jewelry and regal artifacts ever uncovered in Nubia. Her name comes down to us inscribed in hieroglyphs and etched into the walls of ancient temples, notably at Naka, where she commissioned structures that echoed the grandeur of Egypt yet spoke in the local tongue of Meroitic culture. And her tomb, a pyramid at Meroe, robbed in antiquity, but still echoing with wealth and status. The jewelry that survived intricate gold collars, amulets, and rings was a language of power in its own right. Each piece shimmered with intention. But Amani Shaketo wasn't simply a collector of fine adornment. Her regalia told stories of religious symbolism, of her alignment with divine forces, and her grip on wealth extracted from the bowels of Nubian mines. The Kushite economy at the time thrived on iron smelting, gold, trade in ivory, and exotic goods funneled through trans-Saharan root sand. Amani Shaketo's court was a nexus of it all. In art, she appears serene and immovable, framed by gods and surrounded by blessings. She likely ruled during a time of Pisino military campaigns are attributed to her. Unlike Amani Renas, but peace, as we know, is rarely passive. To maintain it in a kingdom surrounded by the ambitions of others requires deft alliances, strategic marriages, and the wisdom to recognize when to pause rather than pounce. One of the most compelling things about Amani Shaketo is the way she threads the needle between spiritual authority and temporal rule. Like many Kandakis, she likely held both sacred and sovereign titles, bridging the realms of the gods and the people. In her iconography, she's often shown in scenes of offering and worship, signaling a ruler who understood power not just as dominance, but as devotion. We don't have long scrolls of her speeches or edicts. We have her jewelry, her temple inscriptions, the remnants of a pyramid now kissed by desert wind. Yet these remnants speak volumes. They suggest a ruler who understood how legacy is curated, not just through conquest, but through culture, beauty, and faith. When you whisper her name, Amani Shakatwat sounds like wind rustling through gold-leafed pages of a forgotten chronicle. She may not be widely remembered in modern retellings of African history, but in the silence of museum halls and beneath the starlight of Nubian nights, her reign in Derisa sovereign cloaked not just in gold, but in grace. Sleep, now, beneath her watchful gaze. Let her story settle in like sand soft, persistent, and rich, with glittering truths yet to be fully uncovered. And then there was Shequeen Asantewa, a name spoken with pride in Ghana and increasingly across the world. Hers is not the story of a passive consort or ceremonial figurehead, but of a woman who stood, quite literally, in the breach when all others had stepped back. Born in 1840 in Besize, a small town in the Ashanti Empire, modern-day Ghana, Ya Asantewa was not a queen in the typical sense, but a queen mother in honorific, steeped in cultural and spiritual importance. In Ashanti society, the queen mother held significant political clout. She advised kings, nominated successors, and, when necessary, became the moral compass of the realm. It was a role that demanded wisdom, courage, and a firm grasp of diplomacy, and Ya Asantewa had all three in abundance. Her legend begins in earnest around 1900, in a time of escalating tension between the British colonial powers and the Ashanti people. The British, with all the blunt arrogance of empire, had already annexed much of the Ashanti territory. They'd exiled the Ashanti king, Prempeh I, to the Seychelles, and their appetite for conquest had not yet been sated. Then came the demand that lit the match. The British governor, Frederick Hodgson, insisted the Ashanti surrender, the golden stool, the sacred symbol of Ashanti sovereignty, the very soul of the nation. Not a throne in the Western sense, the golden stool was believed to house the spirit of the Ashanti people past, present, and future. It was never meant to touch foreign soil, let alone be handed over. While many chiefs were gripped by fear or paralyzed by indecision, it was Ya Asantewa who rose in outrage. In a council chamber filled with men, she famously declared, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white man. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." And fight she did. She marshaled troops, yes, troops rallied warriors, coordinated supply lines, and launched the now famous War of the Golden Stool, also called the Ya Asantewa War. Though she was in her 60s, she led with the fire of a woman half her age and twice as determined. Her command was not symbolic, it was strategic. She fortified the city of Kumasi, led sieges against British forts, and kept morale high even as the British called in reinforcements. Ya Asantewa stood as a true crone seasoned by years, fortified by loss, and possessed of that deep, unflinching wisdom that only time bestows. She did not rise in spite of her age, but because of it. It was, by all measures, an extraordinary act of resistance. Though the British eventually overpowered the Ashanti forces, Ya Asantewa's defiance became legend. She was captured and exiled to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921. But exile could not silence her. In fact, it only amplified her memory. In Ghana today, her name is invoked with reverence and pride. Schools bear her name, statues honor her likeness, songs retell her bravery. And her story is woven into the national consciousness like golden thread. But Ya Asantewa's legacy isn't merely military, it's deeply spiritual, deeply maternal, deeply human. She didn't fight for conquest or personal glory. She fought because she understood the cost of silence. She fought for a people's soul. And in that fight, she became more than a queen mother. She became a guardian spirit of Ghana, a reminder that sometimes, when the world is spinning off kilter, it is the quiet wisdom of women, rooted in love and rage alike, that steadies the axis. So now, as you breathe slowly under the hush of night, imagine her, wrapped in kente cloth, standing tall amid chaos, her eyes calm but unyielding, not a warrior by profession, but by necessity, not seeking war, but refusing surrender. She is the lullaby of courage that hums beneath Ghanaian soil. Sleep, now, in the legacy she helped preserve. The golden stool still stands, and somewhere, perhaps, so does she. Of all the women who have ruled in history, few wielded power with as much architectural ambition, spiritual authority, and political cunning as Hatshepsut of Egypt. She was not simply a queen, she was a pharaoh, one of the very few women to take on that exalted title in ancient Egypt, and the first to do so in a way that rewrote not just protocol, but perception. Born into the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose the first and the principal wife of the king. Her royal lineage ran deep, and from an early age she was steeped in the rituals, symbols, and responsibilities of power. When her husband, Thutmose II, died young, Hatshepsut initially acted as regent for her stepson, Thutmose III. But regency was never meant to last, and Hatshepsut, seeing the instability of a child-led court, stepped fully into the role of pharaoh. She declared herself chosen by the god Amun, adorned herself in the traditional false beard of kingship, and ruled not beside her stepson, but in his stead. This was not merely a power grab, it was a transformation. Hatshepsut's reign, lasting over 2 decades, was one of peace, prosperity, and astonishing achievement. While her predecessors had carved their names into history with military conquest, Hatshepsut carved hers with obelisks, temples, and trade. She reopened trade routes, long dormant, including a legendary expedition to the land of Punt, a semi-mythical region rich with incense, gold, and exotic goods. The murals depicting this journey in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri show trees being brought back, living myrrh trees, a symbol of renewal, spiritual wealth, and botanical diplomacy. Her architectural legacy is perhaps her most enduring monument. The temple at Deir el-Bahri, nestled against the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, is a marvel of symmetry and serenity. Its colonnades seem to breathe with the rhythm of the desert wind. Reliefs and statues show Hatshepsut as both woman and man, god and human, ruler and servant of the divine. She crafted a visual narrative that transcended gender and leaned heavily into divinity, positioning herself not only as the rightful heir, but as a necessary shepherd of the Egyptian people. And make no mistake, Hatshepsut ruled. She oversaw a stable bureaucracy, commissioned countless building projects, and ensured the wealth of the empire flowed like the Nile itself. She did not shy away from power. She wore it like linen in the summer heat, naturally, purposefully, and with grace. Of course, her boldness did not sit easily with everyone. After her death, attempts were made to erase her from history. Her images were defaced, her name chiseled out of inscriptions, and the narrative of her reign suppressed. Some historians believe Thutmose III, now an adult, sought to reclaim a legacy overshadowed by his stepmother. Others suggest it was later rulers uncomfortable with the precedent she set off, a woman not just leading, but embodying the state. But stone has memory, and time has a sense of justice. Hatshepsut's legacy endures not just because of the temples and trade routes, but because of the echo of her authority. She proved that power could be maternal, mystical, architectural, and unapologetically female. Her defiance of convention was wrapped in ritual and limestone, and though the sands tried to swallow her, they failed. And somewhere among the columns of Deir el-Bahri, if you listen closely, you might hear it still, that steady whisper of a woman who ruled not because she was allowed to, but because she was destined to. Hatshepsut was not just a pharaoh. She was a sovereign sorceress, a desert architect, a political crone of the highest order. Regal, cunning, and timeless, she remains a reminder that sometimes the strongest voices come wrapped in silence and stone. In the storied kingdom of Dahomey, where royalty was often synonymous with spectacle, strategy, and ceremony, there emerged a figure whose reign is more whispered than shouted, yet no less formidable for it. Queen Tasi Hangbe, though largely absent from the gilded chronicles of West African monarchies, ruled at a pivotal moment in the early 18th century, when the tide of leadership could shift with a single breath. She stepped into power, not as a placeholder, but as a monarch in her own right at a time when the throne typically passed from brother to brother. Following the death of King Akaba, her twin, Tasi Hangbe, assumed command during a moment of crisis. Her leadership, though brief and later intentionally obscured by subsequent rulers, held its own distinct shape, one marked by both decisiveness and innovation. According to oral histories, it was under Tasi Hangbe that the seeds of the legendary Dahomey Amazonsan all-female military regiment began to sprout. While some accounts suggest her successors formalized this force, it was Hangbe who first deployed women in active defense, recognizing in them the same fierce strength and loyalty expected of any warrior. In a society where women were often consorts or advisors, she placed them at the front lines, a ruler, yes, but also a revolutionary. Her reign was not long, and her name was later scrubbed from many royal records, likely an intentional act by those uneasy with her legacy. But as with many women of power, absence from the scrolls does not mean absence from history. Her story endures in oral traditions, in the ferocity of the warriors she inspired, and in the ripples that still reach us from her quiet, commanding presence. She is the sort of figure who doesn't demand center stage, but whose silhouette can be seen at the edges of every tale of Dahomey's grandeur. A crone in spirit, not aged, but ageless. Not peripheral, but peripheral seeming, until you realize the whole story leans in her direction. And though she reigned for but a flicker in royal time, Tasi Hangbe left a torch behind her that lit the way for a sisterhood of soldiers, of sovereigns, and of seers. Queen Nanny of the Maroons is the kind of figure who slips through the gaps of official history, only to rise again sharp as a machete in the underbrush of memory. A woman of ash and ember, she did not sit on a golden throne or pose for oil portraits in velvet gowns. No. Queen Nanny ruled with something far more enduring than royal decree, the will to protect her people at any cost. Born in the late 1600s, likely in what is now Ghana, Nanny was taken from her homeland through the brutal mechanism of the transatlantic slave trade, but bondage did not tame her. She arrived in Jamaica and, like so many others, was forced into slavery on British plantations. Yet she didn't stay, she escaped, and in the mountains of Jamaica, she rose. There, in the island's thick forests and hidden highlands, Nanny became a general, a priestess, and a mother to a nation. She founded Nanny Town, a maroon settlement tucked into the Blue Mountains, where freedom was not theoretical, it was tactical, and under her leadership, it thrived. The British called her a sorceress, unnerved by her uncanny ability to anticipate troop movements and organize ambushes that turned redcoat uniforms into targets. It wasn't magic, though it might have looked like it. Nanny combined African spiritual traditions with guerrilla warfare, using both ancestral wisdom and lived experience. She trained her people to use conch shells to signal through the dense jungle, to camouflage in plain sight, to strike and vanish like ghosts. Her strategies weren't just military, they were maternal. Every decision she made was rooted in the protection of her people, especially the children. It said she would catch British bullets in her hands and hurl them back. Hyperbole? Perhaps. But the essence is true. She defended with everything she had. Queen Nanny negotiated treaties with the British that secured land and semi-autonomous rights for the Maroons, making her one of the few leaders in the New World, male or female, to win terms with a colonial empire without ever being captured. That's no small feat. That's legend making. Even now, her presence haunts the hills of Jamaica. Statues rise in her honor. Her name is printed on the Jamaican 500 bill. But more importantly, she lives in the songs, in the ceremonies, in the silence after a story is told. Among the Maroons, she is not past. She is principle. And if you listen to the wind in the Blue Mountains just right, you might hear a whisper of her war cry, not born of vengeance, but of vigilance, of a woman who knew that freedom was not a gift. It was a duty, a legacy, a right. She didn't ask to be remembered. She simply refused to be forgotten. And then there was Queen Ranavalona, the first of Madagascar, a woman whose name, like her reign, echoes with contradiction, curiosity, and quiet menace. To some, she was a tyrant. To others, a nationalist heroine. But regardless of the lens, her story is impossible to ignore and certainly not one to skim before bed without a sharp intake of breath. Born in 1778, as Ramavo Ranavalona came into power not by bloodline alone, but by strategic elevation. Her marriage to King Radama, the first of Madagascar, positioned her within the royal sphere, but it was his death and her bold political maneuvering that secured her the throne in 1828. Once crowned, she ushered in a reign that would span 33 years and be marked by defiance, ruthlessness, and an unyielding commitment to keeping Madagascar in Malagasy hands. At a time when European powers salivated over African territories like colonial connoisseurs at a wine tasting, Ranavalona slammed the door then, bolted it, bricked it up, and planted thorny bushes out front. She expelled Christian missionaries, rejected foreign influence, and reinstated traditional rituals and religious practices. Her reign, in many ways, was a wall built against the tide of imperialism. But the wall came at a cost. Ranavalona's policies, while fiercely nationalistic, were also brutally enforced. Public executions became political theater. The use of the tangina ordeal, a traditional and often lethal trial by poison, was reinstated, sending a chill through anyone who dared dissent. Thousands died under her reign, whether by decree or by the harsh demands of her infrastructural ambitions. Her labor policies alone, a mix of conscription and Corva, left a trail of bodies across Madagascar's rugged landscape. And yet, she held the line. While neighboring regions fell like dominoes to colonial rule, Madagascar remained largely independent throughout her life. Her resistance was not polite, it was absolute. She didn't play the diplomatic game. She flipped the board, burned the rulebook, and dared anyone to question her authority. The fact that she was a woman only seemed to make her more determined. Foreign observers, particularly the British and French, painted her as a deranged despot, a woman gone mad with power. But consider the source. These were the very powers she kept at bay. To them, her refusal to capitulate read as irrationality. To her people, at least, some of them it was survival. Ranavalona was no idealized monarch. She was not soft or nurturing in the way so many women leaders are expected to be remembered. But to reduce her legacy to cruelty is to overlook the fact that she did something few others could. She preserved her nation's autonomy in an age of conquest. And here, tucked among the ashes and the iron of her rule, we find the Cronian ancient archetype cloaked in power and paradox. Ranavalona, like the crone, dwelled in the margins between reverence and fear. She embodied sovereignty, yes, but also shadow. She saw beyond charm and compromise, choosing instead the hard road of resistance, even if it meant standing alone atop a throne of thorns. She was not beloved by all, but she was unforgettable. She ruled until her death in 1861, outlasting the monarchs and missionaries who once predicted her swift demise. Her tomb, like her reign, still stands a reminder that history isn't always written in warm light. Sometimes, it's carved from obsidian and lit by moonfire. Call her what you will, tyrant, protector, sovereign sorceress, but Queen Ranavalona the First makes one truth clear: power, when wielded by a woman unafraid of solitude, casts a long and lasting shadow. She arrived not with legions but with visions. Muhumuza, the spiritual leader and resistance figure from the Great Lakes region of Africa, moved through history like a gust that shifted everything in its path. Born in the late 19th century, in what is now Rwanda or Uganda, she emerged at the crossroads of colonization and prophecy. A royal wife turned rebel mystic, Muhumuza's name still murmurs through the highlands, where clouds meet mountaintops and stories are carried in the mist. Her story is one of the most striking examples of crone power, a woman, no longer young, no longer bound by the roles of daughter or bride, but fully awakened in her agency, spirit, and voice. Muhumuza became a spiritual leader after the death of her husband, the Rwandan king Kigeli IV Rwabugiri. She was believed by many to be the earthly vessel of Nyabingi, a powerful spirit goddess whose name means she who possesses many things. Through this divine link, she wielded not only religious influence but political power, standing firm against both colonial authorities and the local kings who bowed to them. While British and German forces scrambled to stake their flags across East Africa, Muhumuza gathered followers not with gold or guns, but with charisma, prophecy, and the promise of liberation. Her vision was radical. She foretold a world free from colonial domination, led by indigenous rule and spiritual sovereignty. Her prophecies, delivered in mesmerizing cadence, promised an era where European control would fall and African harmony would be restored. The colonial authorities, predictably, did not appreciate this vision. To them, she was a subversive, a disturber of their tidy conquest narratives. But to her people, she was something else entirely: a healer, a leader, a spiritual mother who saw beyond the horizon. She led actual resistance campaigns, most notably against the German colonial government in Rwanda. It was not merely symbolic. Her movement was armed and strategic. But the backbone of it all was spiritual authority, her belief, and the belief of her followers that she was protected and guided by the ancestral spirits. Eventually, Muhumuza was captured by British forces in 1913 and exiled to Kampala, where she lived under house arrest until her death around 1944. But exile didn't extinguish her message. Her spirit, the very essence of her leadership, continued to fuel resistance movements long after she was physically silenced. In fact, the Nyabingi movement, inspired in part by her legacy, would become one of the spiritual foundations of Rastafarianism in Jamaica. Through this unexpected diaspora connection, her influence crossed oceans and decades. Imagine her, wrapped in cloth, head high, eyes sharp with the weight of vision, a crone in every powerful sense, unapologetically, fierce, wise, and unyielding. She carried no title bestowed by empire, but she bore the crown of conviction, wrapped in prophecy and resistance. Muhumuza reminds us that not all queens are born into palaces. Some rise from the ashes of loss, reborn as prophets in the service of liberation. In the quiet corners of East African history, she remains a thunderclap, soft in presence perhaps, but booming in legacy. In the lush shadows of the Ivory Coast, where the rainforest breathes against the banks of the Como River, the story of Queen Poku rises like mist at dawn, delicate, haunting, and enduring. She was no mere footnote in the chronicles of African royalty. She was a legend, etched into both landscape and lineage, remembered not simply for her reign, but for the sacrifice that forged a nation. Born into the royal Ashanti lineage, Poku lived in the 18th century during a time of deep unrest in West Africa. As rivalries fractured the powerful Ashanti Empire, Poku found herself caught in the crosswinds of conflict and ambition. When succession disputes turned dangerous, she chose to walk away from the palace's gilded safety, leading her followers westward through dense forest and uncertainty. A queen in exile, but no less regal for it. Their exodus was not quiet. Her people, those who trusted her leadership more than the bloodlines of war, followed her through terrain that swallowed the weak. She was not just their sovereign, she was their compass, their hope, the drumbeat that held them together when everything else fell apart. Her procession was one of endurance, of prayers murmured beneath leaves, of lullabies sung under foreign stars. And then they reached the river. The Como was no gentle stream. It was wide and wrathful, swollen with the season's rain, daring them to cross. Behind them loomed danger pursuers, famine, the ghosts of a past they could not return to. Before them, the unknown. The river marked the threshold, the test, and it was here that Poku's tale would become legend. According to oral tradition, when no bridge or boat could carry her people across, Poku consulted the elders and diviners. The river, they said, demanded a sacrifice, a noble one, a child. Her only son. The choice she made wasn't just maternal, it was mythic. She lifted her boy in trembling arms and whispered a final blessing before placing him into the current. Some say she sang a lullaby, others say she uttered no words at all. The river, appeased, calmed its fury, and parted just enough to let her people cross. From the tears she wept came the name of her people, Baule, from the words Bauli, meaning the child is dead, out of profound loss. A new identity bloomed woven with memory, sacrifice, and resilience. It is no accident that this etymology has endured. It is both tribute and truth. In the Baule kingdom that rose on the far side of the river, Poku's legacy became more than history. She was a queen, yes, but also a mother of a people, a myth-bearer, a woman whose sorrow seeded strength. Her leadership wasn't gilded in palaces. It was carved into migration paths, murmured in prayers, and echoed in names given to daughters born strong. Today, in Côte d'Ivoire, monuments stand in her honor, but they are dwarfed by the immensity of her story. The Como still flows, indifferent yet immortalizing. And Queen Poku's spirit lingers not in marble or museum, but in every woman who chooses her people over her pride, her legacy over her comfort. She didn't simply lead her people to safety, she gave them a soul. And in doing so, she became not just a ruler but a river crossing, a cradle of memory, a queen whose lullaby of sacrifice still ripples through time. So, sleep now, if you wish, to the rhythm of her river, for even in sorrow, she carried beauty. Even in loss, she birthed a nation. Across the golden sands of Nubia, along the bend of the Nile where the desert kisses the river, rose a queen whose legacy still casts shadows across pyramids and temples, Candace Amanitore. Her name, a title passed from queen to queen, was not just a symbol of royal lineage, but of power itself. The term Candace, or Kandake, denoted a line of warrior queens in the ancient kingdom of Kush, a matrilineal society where women didn't merely serve as consorts or caretakers, they reigned. Amanitor ruled during the 1st century CE in the city of Meroe, a bustling capital known for its iron smelting, trade networks, and distinctive architecture. With her co-regent, Natakamani possibly, her husband or Sanchi ushered in one of the last great cultural and architectural booms of Nubian civilization. Together, they built more than 200 monuments, temples, reservoirs, and pyramids. But make no mistake, Amanitore was not simply a royal figurehead. Her likeness, carved into stone, often appears larger than those of male counterparts, of visual cue in ancient art to indicate authority. Aminator's reign was marked by prosperity and resilience. The Meroitic people were skilled at agriculture, even in the arid climate, thanks to an ingenious system of water reservoirs called hafirs. These massive stone-lined basins captured and stored seasonal rains, providing essential irrigation throughout the dry months. Under Aminator's guidance, this system expanded, turning survival into strategy and transforming the harsh landscape into a tapestry of cultivated land. Trade flourished during her time. Meroe stood at a cultural crossroads, linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea. Through its gates passed gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals. But alongside goods, the people of Meroe also exported something subtler and more powerful: pride. Pride in their traditions, their gods, their language. The Meroitic script, still largely undeciphered today, blossomed during Aminator's era. It hints at a people who wrote their own stories, unbent by the narratives of empires. And what of Rome, ever expanding, ever watching, ever wanting? There is evidence both in history and in legend that the queens of Kush stood toe-to-sandaled toe with the Roman Empire. While it is likely Aminator reigned after the most famous clash with Rome, under her predecessor, Amanirenas, the very fact that her kingdom remained sovereign and prosperous during a time when Rome swallowed neighbors whole is a testament to her statecraft. Aminator wasn't simply a queen. She was a builder, a diplomat, a guardian of a fading but fiercely independent civilization. Her pyramids still rise in the Nubian desert, smaller than their Egyptian cousins, but unmistakably bold. They wear time like a veil, but beneath the wear, her story pulses. In a world where women often had to wield power from behind veils and whispers, Aminator ruled from a throne built with stone and sun. She reminds us that influence doesn't always need a sword. It can flow through irrigation ditches, echo through temple halls, and rest in the measured gaze of a monarch who understands the long arc of legacy. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the Sudanese desert under a sky littered with stars, pause, listen. The sand might carry whispers of a queen who carved her name into Timano through conquest, but through cultivation. Aminator's reign is a lullaby of endurance, one still humming through the hush of ancient stones. Some names carry the weight of empires, yet resist the tongue's embrace. Out of respect and to preserve the poetriers will be spoken only once. Shenaktakete was a queen of Kush, a realm nestled along the Nile in what is now Sudan. She ruled in the 12th century BCE, a time when pyramids still rose from desert sands and hieroglyphs still whispered across temple walls. Unlike many rulers of her era, male or female Shenaktakete left behind more than legend. She carved her reign in stone. Quite literally. In temple reliefs and inscriptions, she is shown with the regalia of full sovereign power, crown, scepter, and all. Not a consort, not a placeholder, but the head of state. This alone sets her apart in the ancient world. While Rome flexed its muscles in the West and Ptolemaic Egypt dazzled with imported grandeur, Shenaktakete governed a homegrown African kingdom with roots deeper than papyrus and politics. She was the first known woman to inscribe her name in Meroitic scripta language, still not fully understood by modern scholars. That unreadable script, carved in curves and loops on stone, is a reminder. Even when we cannot decipher every word, the presence of a woman's authority echoes across millennia. She wanted to be remembered, and she made sure her name, however challenging to pronounce, was written in stone, not shadow. Her architecture speaks volumes. She likely commissioned the construction of temples and pyramids, contributing to the architectural legacy of Nubia. In a time when most women of the world were being erased, silenced, or footnoted, she declared herself visibly and monumentally. The queens of Kush, after all, were not figureheads, they were fierce heads of state, commanding armies, negotiating trade, and stewarding culture. And she, one of the earliest, helped set that tone. There's something balm-like in imagining Hera in linen, head high, eyes scanning her court and her kingdom, not flashy, not loud, but firm, rooted. The kind of woman whose stillness carried weight, whose words were few but final. She ruled in an age before hashtags, before headlines, yet her carved image and titles endure. When the night is still, and the desert winds carry dreams shaped like pyramids, remember her, not just for the history she made, but for the way she reminds us that feminine power doesn't always ask to be understood. Sometimes it simply stands etched in stone, unapologetic, and waiting patiently to be rediscovered. As the dust settles on the reign of queens whose names have weathered centuries, some sung, others nearly swallowed by time, we shift our gaze forward. From the etched stones of antiquity to the conference halls and parliaments of the modern era, the lineage of Black female leadership did not vanish, it evolved. The flow of power, once cradled in desert thrones and whispered through royal courts, now moves through ballot boxes, policy rooms, and international stages. These contemporary women may not wear crowns of gold, but they carry the weight of legacy just the same. Let us now walk into the present, where history is still being written by steady hands shaped by heritage and hope. Let's begin with Sylvia Kinigi, a woman who may not be a household name, but who deserves to be spoken of in the same breath as the giants of diplomacy and resolve. In the early 1990s, Burundi was poised on the edge of transformation and potential catastrophe. The country, long marred by ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi populations, was undergoing profound political shifts. In the midst of this precarious moment, Sylvia Kinigi stepped into history. A Tutsi technocrat with a background in economics and public administration, Sylvia had been serving in government positions through a particularly stormy political climate. But in 1993, when Burundi elected its first Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye, and he was soon assassinated during a coup attempt, chaos ensued. It was during this fraught interregnum that Kinigi, Prime Minister, became acting president of the Republic. For about 3 months, from October 27, 1993, to February 5, 1994, Sylvia Kinigi was, effectively, the leader of Burundi. She wasn't crowned or ceremonially installed. There were no military parades or victory speeches, just a woman in a power suit walking calmly through a maelstrom, trying to hold a nation together. It was the first time a woman had taken on such a role in Burundi and the first time in modern African history that a woman had served as head of state in a transitional moment of such tension. And she did it not by barking orders or donning camouflage, but by relying on diplomacy, economic understanding, and an unwavering sense of duty. Her tenure was not long, but its significance cannot be overstated. It was Kinigi who reassured foreign investors. It was Kinigi who brokered stability talks. It was Kinigi who worked to prevent a full-scale civil war that tragically would erupt in the years that followed despite her efforts. Her calm, procedural approach in the face of chaos stands as a lesson in the power of administrative grace. In a world that often applauds loud voices and sweeping gestures, Sylvia Kinigi represents another kind of leadership, composed, competent, and often overlooked. She wasn't a revolutionary with a rifle or a queen with a jeweled crown. She was an economist with a file folder, trying to keep the ledger of her nation from slipping into red. And that, too, is heroism. It's easy to be dazzled by drama, but the quiet administrators, the interim stewards, the caretakers of fragile peace, they are the unsung heroines of history. Sylvia Kinigi may not have ruled for decades or led armies into battle, but she stood firm in a moment when many would have fled. And sometimes, staying in place is the bravest act of all. As the sun sets on the ancient queens and warrior women who tamed deserts and defied empires, we find ourselves in more recent sands grains still warm with memory. Sylvia Kinigi reminds us that power can be soft-spoken, that influence need not announce itself with banners, and that the strength to lead doesn't always come with a throne. Sometimes it wears a pressed blazer, carries a binder full of budgets, and walks straight into the storm with nothing but resolve. In the annals of African leadership, few women stand as regally and as resolutely as Empress Taytu Batul of Ethiopia. Her name may not echo as loudly in Western textbooks, but in the highlands and heart of Ethiopia, Taytu's legacy looms tall, a figure of cunning, command, and unyielding national pride. She was more than consort to Emperor Menelik II. She was his equal in intellect and his partner in power. At times, she was the sharper sword. Born into Ethiopian nobility in the mid-19th century, Taytu was not merely aristocratic by birth, she was formidable by nature. Educated, multilingual, and fiercely strategic, she came to court not as an ornament but as an operator. Ethiopia then was navigating the rising tide of European colonial encroachment, and Taytu, seated beside her emperor, saw the storm coming. When Italy tried to tighten its grip through the duplicitous Treaty of Wuchalemis, translating the terms in its favor, Taytu saw through the deception immediately. While diplomats debated and courtiers hesitated, Taytu took action. She rallied resistance, urged her husband to reject the treaty outright, and mobilized troops with the precision of a seasoned commander. She famously led a contingent of soldiers at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, supplying water, morale, and resolve. Ethiopia triumphed of the only African nations to defeat a European power in open battle during the scramble for Africa. But Taytu's power was not limited to wartime. She founded Addis Ababa, choosing its location for its water and defensibility. She was an active policymaker, involved in both domestic reforms and foreign affairs. And while some courtiers grew uneasy with her influence, murmuring of her temper and willfulness, it was precisely those qualities that earned her the reverence of a nation. Taytu was no shrinking violet. She was a wisteria with thorns. In her later years, when political tides shifted and Menelik's health declined, Taytu resisted those who sought to sideline her. Though she eventually stepped back from public life, she did so only after safeguarding Ethiopia's sovereignty and imprinting her vision on the empire's future. Her legacy today is etched not just in monuments or history books, but in the ongoing pride Ethiopians take in their independence and self-rule. To speak of Taytu is to speak of fortitude in velvet, a tactician cloaked in royal garb, a strategist who wielded both pen and sword. She reminds us that empires are not merely shaped by kings, but by queens who stand beside them or, when necessary, stride ahead. In the shadow of Mount Entoto, where Taytu once walked, her story still whispers, "Hold your ground, speak your mind, and never sign a treaty you haven't read in full." Ellen Johnson Sirleaf didn't just break the glass ceiling, she swept up the shards, built something new with them, and invited the world to sit down and listen. The first elected female head of state in Africa, her rise wasn't quiet, wasn't easy, and certainly wasn't expected by the powers that be. But Ellen was never one for predictability. She stepped into history, wearing grace like armor and wielding intellect like a blade. Born in Liberia in 1938, Ellen grew up in a country founded by freed American slaves to land, with a complex past and an uncertain future. She studied in the United States, sharpening her economic acumen at Harvard, before returning to Liberia with something rare, not just credentials but vision, and a fire that no regime could quite extinguish. Her early career saw her rising through financial ranks, from the Liberian Treasury to the World Bank and the United Nations. But speaking truth to power came with a price. When she criticized the military dictatorship in her homeland, she was imprisoned twice. Yet even behind bars, she planned, she watched, she read, she waited. Liberia's civil wars tore at the soul of the nation. Amid the rubble, Ellen stood tall, not as a distant savior, but as a woman who had bled with her people and believed in healing. In 2005, when she was elected president, it wasn't just a political victory, it was a balm to a battered nation. Her inauguration marked a moment that rippled across the continent and beyond. An African woman not just surviving power, but embodying it with moral clarity. Her presidency focused on rebuilding infrastructure, education, trust. She navigated international aid, homegrown suspicion, and the ever-lurking shadows of corruption with the steadiness of a woman who had seen too much to be shaken. She became a symbol, but never a statue, always moving, questioning, working. And in 2011, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not as a capstone, but as a quiet nod to the strength that had pulsed beneath decades of struggle. Still, Ellen was not without critics. No woman who leads boldly ever is. But she bore scrutiny like she bore everything else, with a mixture of poise, accountability, and a touch of steel. She knew that being the first was not enough. She had to be good, and she had to make room for others. Even after stepping down in 2018, Ellen didn't fade into retirement. She turned her attention to mentoring young women, leading commissions, and continuing to remind the world that African women are not a footnote, they are the headline. In the hush of night, her story reads like a hymn of resilience, a woman who dared to wear the crown not for glory, but for duty, who stayed not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Her legacy? Not just a changed Liberia, but a widened horizon for every girl who saw her and thought, maybe me too. Before she ever stepped into a presidential palace, Joyce Banda had already built a life around advocacy, entrepreneurship, and women's empowerment. Born in 1950 in Malawi, she came of age in a society where women were expected to follow, not lead. But Banda, armed with a keen sense of justice and an unwavering belief in possibility, had other plans. Her early life was not cloaked in luxury or legacy. Instead, it was woven with the threads of real-world struggle, economic hardship, societal limitations, and the ever-present challenge of balancing motherhood with ambition. Her path to leadership didn't begin with politics, it began with business. Banda founded a string of successful ventures, from garment manufacturing to a bakery, while also launching the National Association of Businesswomen to support other female entrepreneurs. For her, economic empowerment was more than a policy, it was personal. She understood what it meant to make something from nothing, and she carried that wisdom into every leadership role she took on. Her political career unfolded gradually, first as a member of parliament, then as Minister of Gender, and later as Foreign Minister. In 2009, she became Vice President under President Bingu wa Mutharika. But when the president died unexpectedly in 2012, and some political factions tried to block her ascension, Banda stood her ground. The Constitution was clear, and so was she. She would become Malawi's first female president. As president, she inherited a nation teetering on the brink. Economic instability, corruption scandals, and diplomatic tensions were the order of the day. Her presidency was not perfect, nor free from criticism, but she set to work with an approach that was practical, people-focused, and undeniably bold. She sold off the presidential jet. She trimmed her own salary. She courted donors and stabilized foreign aid, helping restore Malawi's battered economy. Her policies focused on maternal health, education, and women's rights, reflecting not just her priorities, but her personhood. Internationally, she became a symbol of progressive, Black African woman not only leading a nation, but doing so with transparency and grit. Domestically, her legacy remains more complex, marked by the infamous Cashgate scandal that unraveled in the final year of her presidency, despite her claim that it was she who uncovered it. But beyond headlines and policy papers, Joyce Banda remains a figure of resonance, not because she was perfect, but because she was human, a mother, a survivor, a builder. Her story isn't just about breaking ceilings, it's about laying floors for others to stand on. In a world where many leaders speak of reform, Banda dared to live it from her village roots to the very seat of power. And that journey, with all its victories and blemishes, deserves to be remembered with the weight and wonder it commands. In a time when her country seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, Catherine Samba Panza stood up not as a warrior with weapons, but as a woman with words and will. When she became the interim president of the Central African Republic in 2014, she walked into a role many had fled from, stepping into the ruins of civil war and chaos, and daring to bring balm where there had only been flames. A lawyer by training, a businesswoman by experience, and a peacemaker by instinct, Samba Panza was not tied to any military faction or political party. That in itself was a radical thing. Her neutrality gave her something rare: trust. In a nation ripped apart by sectarian violence, she offered a voice that tried to rise above revenge and retaliation. Her leadership came at a moment of dire need. Churches burned, markets emptied, families hid in fear, and into this, she brought calm, not silence, not inaction, but calm. The kind that allows people to begin again. Her speeches were filled with calls for unity and forgiveness. Her policies were centered on rebuilding of roads, of governance, and of hope. Though her presidency was transitional, her impact was not. She opened dialogues between opposing sides. She encouraged women to step into leadership roles and created space for civil society to participate in healing. And through it all, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who knows that leadership is not about being loud, it's about being clear, steady, and present. Internationally, she was celebrated as a stabilizing force. Domestically, she navigated impossible terrain with remarkable grace. Her tenure wasn't free of criticism. How could it be, in such a fractured environment? But her presence shifted the tone. For once, the world saw a woman at the helm, not for symbolic purposes, but for survival's sake. Catherine Samba Panza did not claim to have all the answers, but she asked the right questions, and in a country gasping for breath, that was enough to open the door to healing. Her legacy reminds us that sometimes the strongest leader is the one who refuses to shout and instead chooses to listen, to gather, and to move forward inch by inch until a broken nation starts to stand again. She doesn't shout, she doesn't need to. In a world that too often equates power with volume, Salwork Zewde stands as a quiet revolutionary woman who governs with grace sharp enough to cut through centuries of expectation. Born in Addis Ababa, long before high-speed internet reached the highlands, Salwork moved with dignity through spaces rarely carved out for women. She studied in France, Paris, the city of lights and diplomacy, and returned not with souvenirs, but with fluency in both language and leadership. She became a diplomat in a world where women's names were still often footnotes, but Salwork, she became the signature. For decades, she served Ethiopia with the kind of poise you can't teach, as ambassador to Senegal, Djibouti, and France, as a representative to UNESCO and the African Union. Her presence at the table wasn't decorative, it was directive. She didn't just pass policies, she passed boundaries, one after another. Then came 2018. Ethiopia, in a swirl of political reform, chose Herto be its president. the first woman to hold that office in Ethiopia's modern history. And not as a symbolic nod either. Her appointment carried weight. Not only because of her resume, which read like a masterclass in statesmanship, but because of what her presidency represented, a recalibration, a course correction. She walked into that office not cloaked in ego, but wrapped in quiet strength. Her speeches didn't bristle with bravado, they rippled with conviction. She called for peace, for equality, for girls to stay in school, and for men to listen more closely. Imagine that power advocating for gentleness, leadership asking for balance. A president who dared to say, maybe the future looks more like nurturing than conquest. And behind every statement, a stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't waver under pressure. The kind of stillness you find in seasoned crones. Yes, crones who've learned the worth of restraint, of timing, of letting wisdom land softly like dusk on the savannah. Salwork never needed theatrics. Her authority came not from showmanship, but from years of service that whispered, I've been here, I've done the work, I know the way. In her presidency, she's championed women's rights, addressed climate change, and advocated for peace in a region not known for quiet mornings. She doesn't wield power like a hammer. She wears it like a shawl, soft, warm, woven from threads of experience, intellect, and unshakable presence. So, when the world turns its head toward Ethiopia, wondering what hope looks like in uncertain times, Salwork stands composed, diplomatic, unwavering. Proof that sometimes the most potent revolution comes in the form of a woman with kind eyes, a calm voice, and a backbone carved from bedrock. Let's rest here for a moment in her story. Let her steadiness settle in your bones. The world keeps turning, but for a moment, let it turn softly, in time with women like her. In the soft rustle of Caribbean trade winds, another kind of power moves not with spectacle, but with the steady rhythm of clarity, courage, and conviction. Mia Mottley, the first woman to serve as Prime Minister of Barbados, doesn't so much raise her voice as tune it to the frequency of justice. When she speaks, the world listens not because she demands it, but because her words ring with something rare, sincerity. Raised in a family steeped in public service, Mottley came of age in a Barbados, still negotiating the legacy of its colonial past. Educated in London and trained in law, she returned not just with credentials, but with a vision that blended the sensibilities of the global stage with the heartbeat of her island home. She was not content to simply sit in Parliament. She led it, shaped it, and eventually rose to command it. Her tenure has been marked by boldness, not the kind that blusters, but the kind that builds. Mottley has spoken plainly at climate summits, calling out inequities not with anger, but with precision. She's defended the Caribbean's right to exist peacefully, sustainably, and sovereignly in a world often deaf to small voices from small islands. She helped guide Barbados through the COVID-19 pandemic and, in 2021, led the in informally cutting ties with the British monarchy, making Barbados a republic. It was a move both symbolic and seismic. And yet, for all her milestones, Mottley leads like a matriarch, one with a sharp mind, a clear tongue, and an open heart. Her speeches are peppered with poetry and plain truth. She's unafraid to reference Bob Marley or Shakespeare, and somehow makes them both feel relevant in the same breath. She isn't just shaping Barbados, she's becoming a voice for the global South, for women in leadership, for thoughtful governance in stormy times. Mia Mottley reminds us that leadership can be warm without being weak, poetic without being performative. She is not building an empire, she's tending a garden, mindful of every root and bloom. And in doing so, she invites the world not to bow, but to listen. Across the ages and across the continents, Black women have ruled not only with power, but with presence. They have led armies, built cities, healed nations, and protected cultures with a grace that defies easy definition. Their reigns have been inscribed in gold and grit, their legacies sealed in battle and breath, and their memories, though too often forgotten by the mainstream, linger in the spirit of those who walk their paths today. From the sun-drenched thrones of Kush and Egypt to the forested courts of West Africa, from island rebellions to presidential palaces, these women forged empires with clarity and courage. Some wore crowns of iron, others bore burdens heavier than gold. Some led through warfare, others through wisdom. All taught us that leadership is not found solely in lineage or law, but in compassion, resolve, and the unapologetic refusal to be erased. They were not perfect. They were not myth. They were real queens and crones, warriors and writers, mothers and monarchs. And in remembering them, we don't just tell old stories, we mend broken threads in the tapestry of world history. We restore wholeness where there was once silence. Their lessons speak softly but insistently to the soul, that dignity can dwell in defiance, that silence can hold wisdom, and that even in the face of erasure, identity endures. These women remind us that greatness is not always loudened, that true power often moves like moonlight, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. So rest now with their stories held close. Let your dreams drift through deserts and jungles, palaces and battlefields, where voices of queens past and present murmur through time, keeping watch through the hush of night. Sleep, beloved, you are in good company.